Selesnya Landfall. On paper, it's a deck that sounds easier to make than a bad decision at a Waffle House, but I actually ended up working harder on this deck than I have any other deck all season so far. That's because I tried a bunch of different stuff and it just kept being bad, to be honest with you. At first I had an idea that I thought had a little bit of promise to it. You try out some Conclave Mentor with some Territorial Scythecats, maybe a little Fearless Fledgling, but it turns out when your deck is mostly based around draft commons and uncommons, it's not a very good deck, Jack, so I went back to the drawing board and decided to play good cards in my Magic deck this time. Tried out a little Skyclave Apparition and a card I was particularly excited about, Yasharn Implacable Earth, but this deck was also pretty stinky, and it turns out Yasharn just a big old pork chop. Just doesn't really do as much as I wanted it to do, even though it fetches you lands for your landfall deck. Hey, seems good, right? It's just not as impactful as it needs to be for 4 mana in a deck like this. So, went back into the lab one more time to mutate the deck into something entirely different yet again, and I finally ended up on a build that I'm proud to bring you. But hey, big bonus for me at least, after today I finally get to stop obsessing over trying to make Scute Swarm work, so that'll be nice for my mental health. But in the meantime, I've got a deck that does in fact take an overhyped and kind of bad card and turn it into a really good Magic card, so let's take a look. What up, Wizards? It's Deb from the place down there. We like it at Magic, and today I finally get to weigh in on Scute Swarm, maybe the most controversial little bug in Magic history. It feels like, even though we're like 6 weeks into the season at this point, it feels like not a day goes by where I don't get some kind of correspondence about this card. You know, whether it's through Twitch or Twitter or my email or the Patreon, you name a way to communicate with me. And through that medium, someone has asked me about this card multiple times, whether it's to tell me that the card is completely banned, oh my god, what do we do about it? Stop Scute Swarm before it's too late. For the record, I don't agree with that opinion. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, I've gotten people just asking me, please, to help them make this card work. And why isn't it working for them? Well, it's not working for you. It's not actually a great Magic card. I've spent a lot of time and mental energy, emotional energy, to be honest, trying to actually put the best shell around this card that I could. And like I said in the intro, I've tried a bunch of different stuff, but I think I've finally answered the riddle. How do you make Scute Swarm good? When is Scute Swarm at its best? And the answer is when it isn't a Scute Swarm. You see, the real problem with Scooterbug is that you're paying 3 whole mana, which is kind of a lot of mana in Standard, let's admit it, for a card that dies to Spikefield Hazard, and Stomp, and Shock, Scorching Dragonfire, Fire Prophecy, what else? Bloodchief's Thirst, Heartless Act, Eliminate, Glass Casket, Elspeth Conquers Death. This isn't the dies to removal argument. This is the dies to literally every piece of popularly played removal in the format argument. So Dev, if the card is such a stink, how do I do the memes that I've seen on Twitter and on Reddit and stuff where people just have like 17 gajillion Scute Swarms in play all at one time, and it's super funny and everybody laughs except the person you're playing against. They're just banging their head against the monitor. Well, it turns out that back to my cryptic words from a moment ago, the best way to ensure this card is even sort of halfway playable at all is to make sure that it's not really a Scute Swarm, like ever, if you can help it. To which you may ask, Dev, how do I do that? See, we're having a good little back and forth here, you and I. Now, in the beginning, you may have noticed that I employed foreshadowing. That's 2 years of an English major working for me there. We're just going to mutate is what we're going to do. Somewhat counterintuitively, because I know I've already said that Scute Swarm is fairly susceptible to removal spells, so it doesn't seem like mutate would be the right strategy. But do notice that if you stick a Migratory Greathorn onto a Scute Swarm, then suddenly it doesn't die to Spikefield Hazard, or Stomp, or Shock, or Dragonfire, or Fire Prophecy, or Glass Casket, or many other removal spells it would otherwise die to, were it still named Scute Swarm. So again, ironically, mutating onto a Scute Swarm actually saves it from being targeted by a ton of the removal it would otherwise die to, which is awesome, but you know, Migratory Greathorn is also pretty sweet to actually stick onto a Scute Swarm, because when you do mutate it, you go and get a land from your deck, put it into play, which procs the Scute Swarm, and get you even closer to that 6 land threshold. And once you do get to 6 lands, and you start proccing this thing's landfall ability, well, it's no longer a Scute Swarm, it's a Migratory Greathorn. So instead of just copying a bunch of 1/1s and getting extra copies of those, you get a bunch of 3/4s, which is better. I think that's better, yes. Now, if there can be said to be an issue with this strategy, it's probably one of opportunity cost, at least in terms of deck building, because once you put 4 copies of a Mutate dude in your deck, You should probably put more mutators in your deck so you can actually proc those mutate abilities as often as you'd like. Now, we're not going to go all in the way some mutate decks do and play like 24 creatures with mutate. We're just going to stick to 12, but this color combination has some of the best mutators in the business. Not just Migratory Greathorn, but also Auspicious Sterix, who is the real Starix of the show. And a little vocab lesson for you. Auspicious means conducive to success. This card definitely lives up to that name. Now, there's a total of 12 mutate creatures in this deck, so you're not going to be mutating Starix as often as you would in a lot of other mutate builds, but it's still not unheard of to mutate a Starix 2, 3, or more times in a game, at which point it is definitely the best card in the deck. But even if you only mutate Starix one time, it's actually not that bad, because if you mutate it onto a Scute Swarm, suddenly, once you get to that 6th land, you're getting 6 6s every time you proc that landfall ability, and that'll end the game super fast. Hey, Ziggy showed up, everybody. That's good news. I think he knew I was about to talk about a cat, and he got a little jelly, because we're also playing 4 copies of Cub Warden in the deck, and even though I've already called Auspicious Sterix probably the best mutate creature in the deck, it's far from my favorite. Cub Warden gets that slot pretty easy, and not just because it's a cat. Now, you won't get all of the extra cats in the world off of this, but what you will get if you put it on a Scute Swarm is eventually a whole bunch of 3/5 lifelinkers, which is exactly what I want against a ton of decks in the format right now. And if you can eventually put this underneath an Auspicious Sterix, you'll have a bunch of 6/6 lifelinkers at the end of the day. And if you can pull that trifecta off, Scute Swarm into Cub Warden into Auspicious Sterix, congratulations, you're winning games of Magic, son. It's not a bad combo at all. But even if you just stop at Scute Swarm into Cub Warden, you're going to end up with enough 3/5 lifelinkers to make your opponent scoop most of the time. Cub Warden is very good. But if we're going to call it a landfall deck, we should probably play landfall cards, aside from just Scute Swarm, which is probably the worst landfall card in the deck at the end of the day, but maybe the best landfall card in the deck. I keep saying that cards are the best card in the deck. There's probably 4 best cards in this deck, but one of them is definitely Lotus Cobra, probably the best thing with the landfall ability printed on it in the entire deck. And you already know this is really good for explosive starts. There's a bunch of lines like turn 2 Lotus Cobra, turn 3 4-drop, or 2 2-drops, which is a relatively common occurrence as well. But there's other esoteric lines you might not see at first, like turn 2 Lotus Cobra, turn 3 drop a Fabled Passage, get that landfall trigger, get your 3rd mana for the turn, cast your Scute Swarm, and then pop your Fabled Passage, go ahead and proc the Scute Swarm. So there's a lot of cool plays like that with Lotus Cobra. Mostly we're using this as a mana accelerant, but what else it is a creature with an enormous target on its back on turn 2. If you play your Lotus Cobra on turn 2, it's fairly likely that they play their Blood Chief's Thirst or Heartless Act or whatever other removal spell in their hand, and that's 1 fewer removal spells they have for your Scute Swarm when you drop it next turn. But moving on to the worst card in the deck, and that is Fearless Fledgling, but nevertheless, I wouldn't play any fewer copies of this card. We need early creatures to mutate onto if we don't get Scute Swarm, or if it doesn't stick around for whatever reason. You know, maybe our opponent leaves our Fearless Fledgling on the table, takes out our Scute Swarm. Well, it turns out that if you put a Cub Warden onto a Fearless Fledgling, your opponent's going to have a problem with that real fast. Same thing with Auspicious Sterix. You know, if you put an Auspicious Sterix on a Fearless Fledgling, then suddenly you're going to have like a 9 or 10 power flying guy every turn. And that also bit of an issue for a lot of opponents. So Fearless Fledgling, when it does stick around, can actually be one of the biggest creatures on the table and one of the easiest ways of getting in reliable combat damage. The deck obviously wants to go wide with Scute tokens, but if you can go tall and just kill them with a 9/9 flyer, why would you not do that? So Fledgling can be good when it's left undisturbed, and some opponents don't take it seriously enough until suddenly it's an Auspicious Sterix they can't Heartless Act, and that can sometimes again be a bit of an issue. But if it does soak up a removal spell in the early game and kind of clear a path for our Scute Swarm, we're okay with that too. I'm also playing 4 copies of Kazandu Mammoth, just a big old elephant man. Not really much to see here. You know, this is just a land or a 3/3 that could also be a 5/5 or a 7/7, depending on, you know, what fetch lands we have at any given time. So this is just a big meaty dude that gums up board states until we can actually, you know, get Scute Swarm tricks off or mutate something cool onto it. So you know, there are some cool plays with it. You know, Kazandu Mammoth into Cub Warden is sort of okay because you'll get, you know, a 5 power lifelinker on a lot of turns so long as you drop a land, sometimes a 7 power lifelinker. So there's some really cool stuff you can do with Mammoth, but for the most part, just a big beefy guy that's also happens to be a land. Pretty good for a landfall deck. But speaking of pretty good for a landfall deck, our final landfall card, it's Felidar Retreat. You knew that card was going to be on the deck. Right? I mean, you had to know that. I don't think I'm surprising you at all. This is another way to go wide if we want to, but if we do have a board full of Scute Swarm tokens, we can just give them all +1/+1 counters. We can do that too. That's totally fine. So whatever you want to do, whatever floats your boat, but this is just a great way to, you know, make sure that we maintain a resilient piece on the board that lets us get back on the table quickly after a sweeper. All we have to do is drop a land or Fabled Passage. We get, you know, 2/2/2s, which is really nice. 2/2/2s. That's a lot of ballerina or ballet equipment there. But in any case, again, this helps you get back on board quickly. It's kind of removal proof, and once you do go wide enough, this makes sure you can actually strike for the kill. Now, before we get to the MDFCs, which will be a great segue into the lands, you'll like the way we formatted the video, but still, before we get to that, I should probably stop off and tell you about the 3 copies of Glass Casket that we kind of shoehorned into the main deck here. The deck just doesn't work without some kind of removal, but Glass Casket, turns out, one of the best removal spells in Standard right now. It takes out pretty much everything in Rogues, especially the really nasty stuff like Nighthawk Scavenger, Soaring Thought Thief, Thieves Guild Enforcer. Against Gruul, it takes out other Kazandu Mammoths and everything, you know, in between to Edgewall Innkeeper and below. So there's just all kinds of really important creatures that Glass Casket helps shut down right now. So I wouldn't be caught dead without some removal in the deck, and I needed to pad out the 2-drop slot just a little bit. So I felt like Casket was a good slot. But aside from that, we've also got 3 copies of Emeria's Call. Not only is it a land for a landfall deck, I hear that's something you want to be doing, but again, if you go really, really wide on the board and you just got a bunch of Scute Swarm tokens or a bunch of Cub Wardens, but you just can't quite get in for the win without losing a bunch of guys, casting Emeria's Call just for the indestructibility can be really, really nice. Plus, it protects you on the crackback by giving you a couple of 4/4s to block with or just get in with. And sometimes we have a really good like ground presence, but if we don't have Fearless Fledgling, we don't have a very good sky presence whatsoever, and we almost never do on our opponent's turn unless we do funky stuff with a Fabled Passage. So we do need a way to block in the air or just get in the air sometimes, and Emeria's Call affords that too. There's just no reason not to play a relatively high number of this card because it does so much stuff, and we ramp a good bit with Migratory Greathorn, so we need, you know, these kind of expensive cards we can cast when we top deck them late in the game. And to that end, we're also playing 1 copy of Turn Timber Symbiosis. Just the 1, and that's a factor of the fact that I wanted to play a certain number of basic lands in the deck. You know, we've got Migratory Greathorn plus Fabled Passage plus Evolving Wilds in the deck, so we're really going after our basics like crazy. So I really wanted to play 11 basics in this deck. And for that reason, I really only found room for 1 Turn Timber Symbiosis, but obviously this can find a Scute Swarm for you, or anything, really. If you just want an Auspicious Sterix that bad, I guess you can have that. Obviously, you can't mutate with it, but you don't care. Sometimes when you top deck this late in the game, your opponent just hits you with a Shatter the Sky or something, you'll be happy that you can cast this. So I'm playing the 1 copy. There's kind of very little opportunity cost to playing this card. Did you guys hear my dog barking back there? I'm pretty sure that's the first audible appearance of the dog. You'll see the dog on camera eventually, I promise. He's a cutie pie. But anyway, let's look at these lands real quick. Like I promised, both Fabled Passage and Evolving Wilds, part of this mana base, but you'll notice the Green-White Temple is not. Now, not only did I feel like we were pushing the number of tapped lands I wanted to play and make the deck still comfortable to play, but like I mentioned a second ago, we need at least 10 or 11 basic lands in the deck, and I erred on the side of caution, went with 11 basic lands, because with Migratory Greathorn, Fabled Passage, Evolving Wilds, all that, plus the amount of lands you just draw over the course of the game, sometimes you'll end up running dry on basic lands towards the middle or end of the game, and I just didn't like when that happened. So I went from 8 basic lands at the beginning here all the way up to 11 just to make sure you don't run into that situation. Let's take a look at the sideboard, but it's actually not too advanced here. A lot of self-explanatory stuff in the board, like the extra copy of Glass Casket to fill out the playset against aggro decks, 2 copies of Heroic Intervention against Shatter the Sky and other sweepers that apply to that, 3 copies of Scavenging Ooze, can be a nice card to mutate onto, but also takes care of the Croxa decks and all kinds of other decks that want to work out of graveyards. There's also 3 copies of Gem Razor in this board. At first I was playing Return to Nature, and then I realized I'm a big old dum-dum, because why not just play another mutate creature so you can get more procs off of Cub Ward and Auspicious Sterix and etc., while also making sure you got a thing in your board that can take out Great Hinges and Embercleaves and Enemy Felidar Retreats and whatnot. It's a very important card to carry in the board. There's also 2 copies of Elspeth Conquers Death, just a little bit more removal, but this time on the higher end to take out much larger threats we otherwise don't have any way of taking out. So we need that card, and it can also help us get back Scute Swarms and such that have died. Very important function of Elspeth Conquers Death. There's also 2 copies of Vivian in the board, really important card for long, grindy matchups. It's especially good in the Rogues matchup, not only because it makes 3/3 reach creatures that kill pretty much everything in the Rogues deck, but also because it's an effective card advantage engine, whether you're tutoring up cards from your deck when you play a creature, or you're just playing creatures off the top of your library. I like this idea a little bit more than the Great Hinge, because we're really not a deck that puts a ton of power on creatures, other than maybe Fearless Fledgling, and even then that has to stay around for a while, so usually the Great Hinge's casting cost won't be decreased by too much, but Vivian turns out to be the much better card advantage engine, all things considered. Aside from that, I'm also playing 2 copies of Ugin the Spirit Dragon, because why not? We ramp enough with Lotus Cobra and especially Migratory Greathorn that we might as well play a couple of copies of Ugin again for these really long games. I do not care that Ugin's going to kill all our Scute Swarm tokens. What I care about is winning the game, especially if the game is going to go long, and Ugin is the best card in Standard at ensuring that you do that. But here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 62, which you may notice is the lowest score of the season. That's because this deck is not Rogues. This deck is not an Omnath deck. This deck is not even Clerics, it turns out. Although I do think the deck could beat Clerics a lot of the time. Just goes to show you that the power rating is not necessarily the end-all be-all, and I've said that a million times before, but I always want to hammer it home. This is just kind of a fun way of analyzing the deck's strengths and weaknesses. No more, no less. So it seems like that's a relatively low score, and the deck does struggle sometimes, especially when it's on the draw. That can sometimes be disastrous. You really want to be on the play with this bad boy, but once you do get set up, it's a ridiculous deck. Even if you're not making a bazillion Scutes, that's not all the deck does. The deck can also make up a billion Cub Wardens, which is what I like to do. But, you could also just go from a creature like Lotus Cobra into Greathorn into Cub Warden, and that's a pretty good play line as well. There's just all kinds of stuff that the deck does, and does really well too. You can go Lotus Cobra into Kazandu Mammoth, and suddenly you're the aggressive player, again, especially if you're on the play. So the deck is a little bit more versatile than it looks, because it just looks like a linear Scute Swarmy thing, but it turns out it's a little bit more than that. If you want to make your Scute Swarm deck good, don't base it entirely around Scute Swarm. I think is what I learned. That's my lesson. That said, if you do get a Scute Swarm on turn 3 and it sticks to the board, gross things ensue from that point in the game, especially if you have a Cub Warden or Greathorn in your hand. You're going to start doing some really just repulsive things. So give this deck a try, because it's not super expensive. It is definitely less budget than your most budget of decks, with the Ugins in the sideboard. I think it's about 175 to build this thing. You take the Ugins out, suddenly it's a lot more reasonable. So try this thing out if you can, and if you want to try it in paper, just click the first link in the description to go over to TCG Player. That's where you're going to get the deck for the cheapest. They also sponsor me, but it actually is where you're going to get the deck for the cheapest. I let them sponsor me because I don't have to lie to you about that. So if you want the deck in paper, it's a lot of fun in paper, but you're going to need tokens. I find that the best thing you can do is go to the dollar store and get one of those bags of like glass pebbles that you put in a fish tank. Those are great for +1/+1 counters or tokens or whatever, but you're going to need a lot of them. But either way, just do that. But in any case, you're probably going to spend more money on tokens than you will this actual deck, because all things considered, it's not that expensive at the end of the day, and it's a whole lot of fun, and it can actually win you some games. I went like 0-9 with the first version of this deck that I built, and then I went like 7-2 or something like that. I think I played 9 games with both decks. With the other version of the deck that I built, and I was just feeling terrible about this deck. I felt like this whole deck tech was just going to be me ripping on Scute Swarm, which I have done some of. But end of the day, I did end up finding a deck that, again, was a little bit counterintuitive in some ways, but actually ended up working the best out of all these decks. I ended up going 6-3 with this deck. So, still not the best record in the world, but a winning record is a good record in my mind. So try this thing out, even if you don't, crush a Grand Prix with it. Remember Grand Prix? I miss the world. But even if you don't crush an event with it or anything, it's still going to be a really fun deck just to mess around with. So I hope you get a chance to try it out. I actually did have a lot of fun building it, even though I think I probably accelerated my baldness a little bit. And of course, we're going to be playing the deck on stream before too long here. If you haven't come by the stream yet, make a point to do that. It's twitch.tv/SBMTGDev. I stream about 3 times a week, usually for about 2 hours at a time. And if you don't catch them live, you can watch the VODs at that same Twitch address. So check it out. There's a whole wealth of content over there, and we have a whole lot of fun. I enjoy my time on Twitch, and there's a reason I've been doing it so often lately, because it's so much fun. So if you're not part of the party yet, do that. Join the Strictly Squad. Remember when we tried to make that work? Do it. Either way, no matter what you do, just like the video. That puts it in the algorithm. More people see it. Theoretically. I'm not actually sure. More people can see the video if you like it, so do that. And of course, sub. I found out. You're supposed to say this. Apparently this works. Let's see if it does. Apparently, this is true though. About 40% of the people that watch my videos aren't subscribed to me. So just one click. Just do it this once, even if you're not the kind of person that subs to YouTube channels. I'm really trying hard to get to like 125K. We're really trying to get to like 150. So be part of that. Be part of that. And click the subscribe button. And also hit the bell for the notifications. You know what YouTube is. Do the stuff. Apart from that, if you want to help support the channel even more, and, actually get something out of it, if you want to vote on what content we do around here, go to the link in the description or just go to patreon.com/SBMTG. And if you pledge $1 a month, you get to vote on what decks and videos we do on the channel and what decks we play on Twitch sometimes. So I think that's worth $1. It's not bad. $5 a month, you get a signed card. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. You get your decks played on the stream at the highest tier. So, if it interests you, do it. If not, I'm just glad that you're here. I love you very much. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this one, because this was way more work than I ever anticipated on doing for Scute Swarm. But again, I'm happy with the final product, so I hope you get to give the deck a shot. Let me know how you feel about it in the comments section, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.